Hello, beautiful soul family. Britt Cannon here, host of the Walk On podcast, the podcast where I try to demystify spirituality, personal growth and healing, and whatever else I feel like talking about. These little YouTube videos are short companion pieces with the video component that go along with the topic I discuss on my weekly hour-long podcast. The Walk On podcast. And this week's episode is called What Gender? And it's about the gender binary and looking at it as a construct or as a program that is put into us by, the societal collective consciousness that limits us with the weapon of the white supremacist capitalist cis heteropatriarchy and puts us into all these little boxes and labels that may limit the vastness of the expression of the universe that we are. I speak about how the gender binary is put into our little squishy sponge brains from a very young age. Working with children, it's astounding to me how young the, pink is for girls, blue is for boys, boys can be doctors, girls can be nurses, boys are superheroes, girls are girlfriends, girls are props for the patriarchy. And how, it's just so obvious that when we're born and when we get very, very old, we embody this androgyny that as babies just means that we haven't yet been programmed. I mean, also there's this thing of puberty or whatever. There are biological differences, but even that isn't as binary as we're told it is and as many people believe it is. And how when we discuss things in such a limited this or that way, it just isn't the full story. And it also leads to these expectations that we put on each other and that we put on ourselves, which causes discord within us, a lot of us at least. I definitely think there are some people who are fine, representing, embodying, being the gender that they're assigned at birth. But I feel like for most people, if you think of just the layout of data, how it usually falls in a bell curve, anything that's on a spectrum, there are sort of outliers on the extremes, but how most of the data falls in the middle. That's the highest point of the bell curve, is the middle. So that would mean that just statistically speaking, most people fall somewhere in the middle. We're kind of born androgynous, and as we get older, we kind of become more androgynous. And I think that's, in the beginning, it's not being programmed yet, and towards the end of our lives, it's more about just not giving as much of a fuck about what other people think about you, about your appearance, about the binary. That's not to say that old people don't tend to carry some pretty antiquated views on the world, but that's just to say that if you look at the natural progression of things and the people who exist beyond the programming, who aren't as beholden to conforming to the programming to be safe and exist, it's kind of like how women are written off after menopause because you're no longer patriarchally sexually viable, right? So if you're written off anyway, then you don't care as much about conforming to it, and that is the point I'm getting at. And I think that we could all stand to carry a little bit of that lack of fuckness in regards to gender, or just deprogram the beliefs we have about it, especially, and I get into this big time in the podcast episode, but especially when we're dealing with children. If you're a parent, if you're an educator, if you're a caretaker, if you're just a cool person in a child's life, is just try not to project that gender on them. Try not to have expectations about who they'll be. One of the biggest and most important aspects of loving someone, really truly loving someone, is giving them the freedom to be who they are, giving them the space free from your own expectations and projections about who they'll become, and just observing and watching and loving and celebrating that journey with them, as opposed to constantly making them feel disappointed by not living up to the expectations that you created in your own mind, which have nothing to do with that little person. Just like let it go. Same thing with sexuality. It's kind of like no one would need to come out of the closet if nobody's parents ever just expected them to be straight. And I know this is tough for people who exist in the programming, or like, it's kind of like the more you adhere to the white supremacist, capitalist, hetero patriarchy, like the more you naturally fit into those standards, which is white, straight, cis. And then if you're like a woman in that realm, then you're like femme, thin, subordinate. Like the more you adhere to those standards, the safer and more comfortable you are in the system. And I think the less likely it makes you to want to change. It's the people who are uncomfortable in the system who carry the burden and the responsibility of calling it out and dismantling it. But that's not the way it should be, because even if you're comfortable in it, guaranteed it still hurts you. Guaranteed you were told you couldn't be a certain way or do a certain thing because of arbitrary societal expectation and limitation. So yeah, that's mainly the point of this week's episode, which is just like, let's unpack gender. Let's see it as a construct. Let's like get the fuck over it. Let's stop like projecting and torturing each other with this belief. And one of the ways, just to speak for cis men for a second, but like the way in which the patriarchy hurts cis men is by distancing them from their emotions, from their sensitivity, from their humanity, to the point where a lot of cis men walk around having no idea how they feel. They just know what they're supposed to feel, which is nothing, and all they're good for and all their value is put in how they can provide on a financial level for their families. And I think that's a real bummer. We are not what we earn. That's the whole like vibe of anti-capitalism, right? Is that we're worth more than what we earn, that's not our destiny, that's not our, that's just not the full story of us. And so that, even if you're a cis man, even though if you're assigned male at birth and you're like, fuck yeah, that feels good to me, you could still unpack gender and gender expectations. And you wouldn't be as likely to be homophobic if you did that, because a lot of homophobia is rooted in this gender binary and like what is supposed to be the norm. Anytime there's an idea of like a norm, like straight is the norm and then everything else is other, what that means is the other is dehumanized. The other is seen as less than because it's not normal. Same thing with whiteness. Like the reason why whiteness is such a force in the world is because at a certain point someone decided it was the standard, it was the norm, and everything else was other. And that's what creates racism, is this hierarchy that is a total lie. It's a total program. It's a total construct. And that's, I also talk a lot about that. Like the history of queer liberation is rooted in anti-police sentiments, because police have been historically oppressive and violent towards the queer community, especially those people who express themselves as gender nonconforming, which by the way has been happening since the beginning of humanity. So it's not weird, it's not new, it's not a trend, it's been around for literally ever. Just because something has been historically erased doesn't mean that it didn't exist. In fact, that's usually one of the biggest tactics of the white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy in order to uphold those standards and those hierarchies and those like norms and others is by erasing the fact that these things have always existed. Erasing the fact, for example, that like indigenous cultures were thriving and peaceful and cooperative. Sometimes I need to stop and take a breath. So yeah, let's all get together and unpack gender this Pride Month. Because it'll do us good. Oh, that's what I was talking about. Queer liberation rooted in anti-police sentiments and in labor unions, in communism and anarchism, and in the intersectionality of racial justice and feminism. It's all, you can't really look at one, you can't really unpack one area of challenging the white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy without then seeing all the other intersecting ways that that machine works to oppress us. And so it's good for you on every conceivable level. And if you find yourself in resistance to this, if you find it making you angry, if you find yourself trying to figure out people's gender when you're in public in a judgmental way, ask yourself why. Ask yourself why you care so much about how other people live their lives. Ask why you feel the need to uphold something that only really does harm. Like, what good has the gender binary brought any of us? And gender roles and gender limitations and gender separateness. Everything in life is a spectrum. And it's not a spectrum as in like a straight line, but a spectrum as in like, whoa, it's a spectrum. Life is just an acid trip, you know what I mean? Just like be a rainbow. Anyway, I guess that's all I have to say. Unpack it. Listen to my podcast, links down below, and have a happy Pride, I don't know. It's been a rough year. Let's love each other a little more. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you soon. Bye.